Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're at in the world. Welcome to the webinar, Go with the Flow, Automating Business Processes with Clicks. My name is Bill Takacs. I am the product manager for visual workflow here at Salesforce. You can see my contact information on this slide. If you have questions after this webinar or for any reason need to reach out to me, you can reach me at Twitter at SFDCBill or via my email address, btakacs@salesforce.com. So before we begin today, we need to talk a little bit about Safe Harbor. For those that don't know, Safe Harbor is securities law here in the United States. And feel free to read this slide, but I'll summarize this slide for you. The gist of this slide means that if you're going to make a purchase decision about Salesforce, you need to make that decision based on the features and functionality that we have today, not what we're going to talk about in the future. I am going to show some things with regard to visual workflow that you'll see in Summer 14, so that's why this slide is relevant. So if you need to connect with us, we have quite a large social presence here at Salesforce, specifically for developers. You can see our Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and G+, and the ways that you can connect with us there. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our site. We'll show you where that will be towards the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions after the webinar, you can certainly reach out to us with these various social tools. So if you have questions during the webinar today, don't hesitate to post them. You can post them in the chat window. We have a number of people who are standing by waiting to answer your questions. I will also do a live Q&A at the end. There's some Q&A etiquette here on the slide. Please don't repeat questions. The team is definitely will work through the queue as fast as possible. And again, as I said on with the previous slide and our social presence, if you have more questions, you can visit developer.salesforce.com/forums. We also have a success community dedicated to our process automation tools here at Salesforce. We'll give you a link to that site at the end where you can post questions. The visual workflow and process automation community here at Salesforce is very robust. Lots of folks will help if you have any questions or issues. And of course, we monitor that here at Salesforce as well and chime in when appropriate. So the quick agenda here, the what and the why and the how today, all around visual workflow. In the how portion, I'll actually do sort of a deep dive walking you through a flow that I've built around lead processing. We'll also sort of see it in action and talk about the different ways that you could actually deploy that flow into your organization. So why use Salesforce and the Force.com platform? Well, this slide gives you a good illustration of all of the pieces that you have to do if you were going to do it by yourself or do it DIY. So everything from purchasing hardware to sort of deploying it, a lot of effort. Whereas in Salesforce, you can sign up for a developer account and immediately get started. Be more productive and be more efficient. The other thing that's great about the Force.com platform here at Salesforce is that we meet people in sort of two paths. So if you're a developer and you have a programming language or a set of tools that you're very comfortable with, we certainly support that. We support that not only with Force.com, but we also support that with our Heroku cloud, our app cloud. So very rapid way to get in and get started and get developing. We have a rich set of APIs and frameworks that you can use on both programmatic platforms as well. Now we also meet folks who are business analysts, IT engineers, or IT people with our declarative tools. So they allow you to make use of the Force.com platform in a very declarative way, drag and drop, clicks not code. And that's exactly what visual workflow is all about, and we're going to do a deep dive on that today. So what is visual workflow? Well, I just said it's a declarative tool set to sort of build applications with, but you can automate processes, you can build workflows, and you can do that relative to the Salesforce domain. So anything that touches marketing, sales, service, and support that's inside of our clouds, you can certainly work with Visual Flow to automate processes and streamline processes. Visual Workflow is also extensible. It can consume Apex. We have an Apex plugin for visual workflow, so you can write Apex classes and call them within a flow. You can also deploy flows to Visualforce pages, get a little bit more styling and control over your flow execution. So we're really working on a number of enhancements for visual workflow to extend its capability just beyond handling screens. We really think of it as process orchestration. So anything that has to touch, again, sales, service, marketing, support, we want to be able to handle from a process standpoint. In addition, if you need to go out to external systems, we want to enable that as well. And we think of it as sort of business process management light. We're not trying to build a middleware layer here at Salesforce. However, we do want to be able to handle sort of any process use case you might have. So that includes things like processes that might have to have parallel execution paths, processes that might have to wait, and then processes that might, again, have to go externally, bring data in, be manipulated, and write them out. So why automate? Well, what you do is just as important as what you don't do. And there's a number of good reasons to use visual workflow to automate your business processes. So, obviously reducing the need for developers. Anytime you start a development project, there's a lot of effort involved in terms of getting requirements established. In the case of a process, getting the process established, bringing stakeholders to the table. It can take a fair amount of time. And of course, developer resources in most companies are scarce, and you want to really deploy those resources to solve the most valuable business processes. What Flow can do is enable declarative users to build business processes and reduce the need for developers. Basically reduce your cycle time to deploy applications or to automate things to make you more efficient. You can replace utility Apex. So as a good example, one of our users just posted to our success community that with a new feature that we have coming in summer 14, they were able to replace 64 Apex triggers and 64 workflow rules with one visual workflow. A good example of just making things more useful and more efficient. And then the last thing is really just automation saves time and money. So really, what are we trying to solve here? And there's a whole list of things here all around automating work. But really, it's all about getting efficiencies back from things that you do over and over. And it isn't just the fact of, from automation that saves time. Standardization of processes gives you a lot more control over things in your environment. And then once you standardize, you can optimize. So there was a book written in the 90s by a Harvard professor named Michael Hammer. It's called Re-Engineering the Corporation, and it kicked off a lot of effort around this concept of process-centric organizations. And he has a thing that is a cliche that I like to repeat a lot called the first step in any automation process is just to pave the cow path. If you think about all of the processes that you operate in your company, there are a lot of them. And if you don't think you have them, please re-examine, because you do. There are things you do every day, a series of clicks you have to do, a series of clicks followed by emails that you send. All of these things can be automated and free you up to do more valuable work. And so that brings me to value. So really, where's the value in sort of automation? So in terms of lower cost, you can reduce the need for your users to interact, and you can get more done basically by having higher throughput. You can reduce cost and complexity as well. If you have scripts, for example, you can standardize those scripts and use visual workflow to guide your users through those scripts. You can remove errors, especially with regard to data. If you have a manual process where you're filling in forms or you don't have it standardized, you can use Flow to do that to really make it more efficient. If you have any compliance issues that you have to handle, again, Flow can standardize those inputs and outputs with regard to the process that you need to do for compliance and really save time or save money in terms of avoiding penalties. You can accelerate your service operations, repair turnarounds, and or any sales cycle or service cycle or supply chain dependencies, really by making things more more standardized and more streamlined. So let's dive into flow and talk a little bit about flow. I'm going to give a quick high-level intro, and then we're literally going to walk through the Cloud Flow Designer, what it does, and all of the elements in it. So flow, you can think of visual workflow as literally like a flow chart. And we have a tool that you can use to sort of build these flows, literally drag and drop of the process of a process as it goes from the beginning to the end. Another great thing about flow is it has logic operators in it. You can do if-then statements, so sort of decisions. In Summer 14, we have a new element that you can now loop. And we have variable containers that can store a lot of data. There are a number of things to consider when you want to get ready to use flow. And like any tool or any time you start to build something, you really want to think through what you're building and do a little planning before you start to execute. I'll talk a little bit more in depth about this at the end with regard to best practices and see some of them in action. But in the case of flow, you want to think about what data you want to access, what fields you need from the objects, and if you're going to create new records or new objects, you want to think them through as well. So just before we dive in, let's talk a little bit about use cases. You can see here a number of what I'll call high-level use cases, and I'll give some examples here. But for example, if you're in a call center, you can build a series of screen flows that show your users standardized scripts and walk your call center operators through those scripts. You can do that for sales folks as well. The other great thing about Flow is that it can show users data, and it can allow them to edit or update that data. So in the case of a user calling an inbound call center, you can guide a call center agent through a particular process or script for a customer, collect data, and update that data in real time. Configuration. So it could be product configuration. So if you have a sales organization where the product that you sell consists of a bunch of subcomponents, Flow can literally walk sales folks through configuring a product, or a sales engineer through configuring a product, create a quote, and then send that quote to the customer, all automated, standardized way. Another example that one of our customers has given us is they actually do server configuration with Visual Workflow. And the way that works is that if I need to update a server config as a sysadmin, I can kick off a flow, type in a configuration, that gets routed to another sysadmin for review, and if that sysadmin signs off on it, Visual Workflow will literally connect to the server and update the configuration. So again, starting to avoid errors, logging what's happening, and really getting efficiency in terms of not only having misconfigurations, but also just more efficient process. And then the employee onboarding really speaks to a lot of the administrative processes that you might have in a company. Not too long ago, there were a lot of things that were done with forms. You would, connect to the web somewhere, hit a website, fill in a form, that would get routed to somebody. Somebody might sign off on it or update it. You can now do that with Visual Workflow for just about any administrative process that you have, and that could be granting access to systems, time off forms, a whole host of administrative use cases for Visual Workflow. So Visual Workflow has three main components, or we like to think about three components. So one is the designer, and that's where you go in and build flows and test flows for any of the processes that you're building. There's also a management component, and that management component basically lets you see the flows that you have built, ones that you have active and deployed to your users. And as we add additional functionality to Visual Workflow, we'll also start to add additional data into our management console. And then the last piece is runtime. So when you launch a flow, there are screens, so it has the capability to style those screens, and as I said earlier, you can also deploy those to Visualforce pages. So really three kind of key components to flow runtime. So let's dive into the designer. I'm going to walk you through actually seeing or taking a look at the Cloud Flow Designer. I just want to give it a minute to make sure that everybody can see my screen. So across the top, there are three tabs here. So palette, resources, and explore. I'll explain what each of these tabs are and what each of the elements are in these tabs. So the first element that we have here on the palette is called the step element. And what the step element is designed to do is you can drag it to your canvas, and you can literally prototype or build out your flow with these step elements. So you can think of this as a drafting tool, not unlike you might use Visio or Lucidchart with, but it's a really great way for you to sort of build a flow first, thinking through all of the elements that you might need, all of the objects you're gonna work with from a Salesforce perspective, as well as all the fields you might need to work with. So really a draft tool to help you build your flow. The next element is a screen, and the screen element has a number of different elements within it. I'll talk about them. So as with any element, you have to give it a name and a unique name. And in the case of a screen element, you need to make sure you have a variety of different inputs, way for users to get data or have choices for users. So these are choice options, and radio buttons, drop-down lists. We also have checkboxes and pick lists, and then we have a way to output choices. Now, anytime you use one of these elements, you have to give it a unique name. So you have to give this a unique name so that it can be referenced within the flow, and then you can actually update the element itself. Now, before I go on, one thing I forgot to mention is sort of a key concept in flow. And the way the flow works is that when you build your flow, you declare variables within that flow for usage in the flow. And then you bring data from Salesforce into the flow, into these variables. You can manipulate them in the flow and then write them back or show them as needed. So flow has its own sort of variable containers that you can operate within the flow and use data. And of course, we're going to see all this in action. So as I said, we have some logic operators. So one is a decision. So this is sort of your branching, your if-then branching logic statement. We have an assignment statement. So if you use data and you change it and you need to assign it to a variable and write it back, that's what the assignment's for. And of course, we have a looping operator, so you can grab a collection of records, operate on them, and loop over them and operate on them. We have a number of different data elements that you can work with. So individual records, you use these record create, update, and lookup with what we call standard variables. In Summer 14, we have new variables called S-objects. I'll talk about them in a minute, but we have the fast elements to use with S-object variables. And the reason is the S-object variables can make more efficient use of the platform and really help you start to reduce the hitting limits on both the platform and within flow. Another great feature about visual workflow is that you can actually use subflows. So that if you have a really large process, you can, just like a programming language, actually break it down into smaller pieces. And of course, if you have various utilities that you use over and over in a process, you can make subflows of those utilities and then string them together in a single flow. And of course, this will help with debug, and this will just make more efficient use of flow. Another new feature in Summer 14 is our ability to consume publisher actions. I'll actually show you this today, but you can see the actions in the pane here. It makes it very easy to sort of do things like create tasks and emails, create contacts, create case, really sort of provide an ID and fire. Let's move on to the resources tab. So as I mentioned, we have a number of variable types. We have standard variables and S-object variables. And we have S-object collections. So an S-object variable, a standard variable is just that. It's a variable container, holds sort of one field or one element or one piece of information at a time. S-object variables allow you to talk to a Salesforce object and get all of the related fields off a record sort of in one variable to operate in a flow. It just makes it more efficient within a flow to operate on data. We also have an S-object collection, and as you can imagine, it is a collection of records that you can pull from a particular object. And what's great is in the case where, as a use case example, if you need to reassign a sales rep, you could build a flow that pulls in all of their records in an S-object collection, iterates through them, and reassigns them based on some logic that you've determined for reassignment. Very efficient way to handle a process that's probably done manually quite often. We have the ability to have a constant, so if you have a constant value that you need to reuse all the time, you can declare that as a constant reuse of flow. We have our own formula editor, so if you need to use a formula, you can build a formula and consume that in your flow. A text template is a reusable piece of text that you need to use throughout the flow. As an example, in Summer 14, we have an action where you can send an email. It's a good use case where you'd want to use a text template. And of course, you can place variables within that text template so that when you hit that particular element in your flow, it'll fill in the variable values there and send the email. And then we have two types of choices. So one sort of static choice, you can think of those as sort of like yes/no buttons or yes/no choices, and then dynamic choice, obviously one that's built dynamically. And then the last piece is the Explorer. And what the Explorer does is anytime that you declare a variable or use an element, they will all show up here in the Explorer, and we'll see an example of that working live in a minute. Now I'm going to flip back to the presentation for 1 second, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the flow that I have. So as I said, before you begin building a flow, you kind of think what you need, what you want that flow to do, and think through the objects you're going to use, the elements you're going to use, and the variables you might need. So in the case that I'm going to show you today, what this does is actually looks up a lead, it assigns a lead to the correct sales rep based on their geographic territory, and it creates tasks for the sales rep to follow up with that lead, and it emails the rep that they have a new lead. Pretty basic flow, but it's a good use case to show you many of the elements that we just talked about. So variables we'll need. So we need a variable to bring the lead into the flow. Now a good best practice to use with flow is to work with IDs. IDs are great ways to sort of get Salesforce data out of various objects. And in this case, we're going to use the lead ID to sort of kick off the flow. We need a variable to hold all of the lead data. So we look up with the lead ID, and then we want a container that holds all the relevant fields we need to make it to make the flow work. And in this case, we'll use an S-object variable. We need a variable to set the lead to the correct owner. And then we need a variable to hold all the sales reps information so that we can email them and create the task. And then elements that we're going to use in the flow. So we're going to need screens for user input and debug. I'll also show you a case where this flow does not need any screens, and I'll talk a little bit about how that can be used at the end. We'll want to use some fast lookups to get the lead information as well as the sales reps information. We'll use a fast update to update the lead's owner. We'll use a text template for the email. We've got some decision logic to decide what sales rep the lead belongs to. We have actions to create a task and send an email, and then we'll use a formula to compute the due date for the task, and last but not least, we need to have some assignment cases to assign the lead to the correct owner. So let's go ahead and walk through the flow. So if you want to follow along, I'll give you a couple seconds to bring up the Cloudflow Designer. So if you go to Setup, Create, Workflow and Approvals, and click Flow. Let me just show you that here. So if you go to Setup, and you scroll down here, and you go to Create, and you go to Workflow and Approvals, and you click Flow, you're going to come to the main flow page. So as I said, we have some flow management. We do support versioning. So if I actually click on this here, you can see that I've got 3 different versions of this flow. I'll explain what they are. But to sort of get into the designer to follow along, just click New Flow, and you can follow along with me. So as I said earlier, a best practice use case is to use screens for debugging. Another good best practice to use is some type of convention for the elements that you use as well as the variables that you use. And I'll show you some of these as we go along. So in the case of building this flow, what I've done to help debug is really put in a screen where I can collect the lead ID and have it kick off the flow. Now, flow can actually start or be kicked off via a URL, custom button, or link. I'll actually show you that as well. But in the case of starting to build your flow, you might just want to do it manually to make sure you've got everything working before you activate it and let your users loose on it. So all this does is this is actually a text box that I have right here. And I'm just collecting the lead ID. I could put validation rules in here if I needed to, but I'm not in this case since it's just a debug screen. And if you take a look at this particular screen, I've called it debug 1, and as you notice, I'm using the convention debug number throughout the flow to manage the debug screens. So the next thing I do is I actually use a fast lookup element. And you can see I gave it a name, lookup lead info. And I'm going to look up on the lead object, and I want the ID field equal to whatever I put into that screen. So the value here is actually a screen input field that I'm passing into the flow. And then when I get, what I want to do is I want to get all of the relevant information off the lead that I need to process it. So I obviously need the lead ID, the owner of the lead ID, first name, last name, city, state, and zip/postal code for the lead. Now I've created an S object variable here, and you can see I'm using a convention svar and then the variable's name in this particular flow. Now, flow's great because as you go along, you can actually create these variables on the fly, so you can do it that way. Or if you're really organized and want to declare them before you actually build the flow, you can sort of come to this pane, and the resource pane, and double click and create one there as well. So I'm going to go back to the palette. So the next step I've done is I've actually created a debug screen to show that I've successfully retrieved all of the lead information. And all of this is a text screen, and I'm following a convention here, giving it a unique name, show info to, and I'm showing all of the relevant, all of the data that I've retrieved from the lead object for that particular ID that I inputted. The next step in the process is some decision logic that I've started to build. So the first step in the process is to start to determine which sales rep is going to own this lead. Now in this use case, as an example, just thinking it as a company that operates in California, has 2 sales reps, one in Northern California and one in Southern California. All of the leads that actually come in to this particular company that are not in California get assigned to the VP of Sales. So I'll actually go down that branch first and show you how that works. So let's take a look at a decision. So I've given it a name is the lead in California. And I have 2 outcomes here, one in California, and then I have a default outcome which says if it doesn't meet this particular income, go down this branch, the default branch, which I've labeled not in California. And what I've done here is I've created an S object variable called this is the lead S object variable that I declared earlier where I looked up the lead information. I'm saying is this variable equal to California? If it is, go down the California branch. If it's not in California, go down the not in California branch. And so you can see right here that I have this not in California branch going down this way. So I'm going to move the designer down a little bit here. So the next thing I do is I've just created a screen with a simple text output that says, hey, you've made it to other states in California, letting me know that I've retrieved the lead that's not in California, and then I'm going down the right path. Again, I can tell that that the lead is not in California because I'm actually showing the lead info that I've looked up right here in this debug screen. So the next thing I want to do is assign the lead to the VP of sales, and that's exactly what this does. I'm using a new S-object variable here called rep lookup information, and I've set that title to the VP of sales. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually update that lead information with a fast update. And what it will do is it will take all of the S-object variable lead info. I've already set the owner to be the VP of sales, and it will go ahead and update the lead's owner to be the VP of sales with this step. The next thing I put in here is that I've got all of the relevant information from the rep info. Make sure I've done the lookup correctly. So again, just a simple screen showing me all the variable information. And then the next thing I've done here is I'm setting a task for the owner of the lead, the new owner of the lead, to follow up with the customer. Now, you can see right here that I have a due date for lead follow-up. It's actually a variable type. It's actually not a date. I used a formula to compute that, and I'll show you that in a moment. But I'm just setting the leads, the task's owner to the owner of the lead. I'm putting that task on the lead, and I'm setting a subject for follow-up and setting a due date 1 day after the lead came in or it's been processed. So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at that formula. So this is a pretty simple formula. The value data type I set to date, and I'm using a system variable called flow current date. And all I'm doing is adding 1 to the current date. Pretty basic formula, but you can kind of get an idea of how that formula works. Now the next step in the process that I've done is I'm going to send an email to the rep to let them know they've got a new lead. So the email address I'm pulling after I've looked up the sales rep's information. That's the sales rep's info. I have a text template here called new lead body. I'll show you what that text template looks like in a minute. And then I've set a subject called new lead. And then last but not least, I've set a finish screen in the case of this flow that's got all the debug information to know that I've completed. So let's look at this text template. So a text template is a lot like a screen field. I've given it a unique name, and I've got some text here. It says, hi, you've got a new lead, please follow up. And then I'm putting in all of the relevant lead information that I have in the flow right now. So the first name, last name, city, state, and zip of the prospect. So the only other thing I want to show you before we can kind of give this a little test drive is I actually want to show you this part of the flow. So the thing I'm doing right here is I'm just saying again that I branched to California, just to know that I'm in the right place. And then I've got some decision criteria here, a couple different, or decision with a couple different outcomes. So the first one is NorCal. So, and what I've done here is I've taken the lead city from the S-object variable that I've looked up the lead info, and I'm saying if it's equal to any of these cities, and you can see that I can use and or logic here, and in this case it's or. And I could keep adding cities. You could do this with postal codes. There's a whole host of ways that you could actually build this decision logic. Just wanted to show this simple use case. But if it's in any of these cities, it's going to go down the SoCal branch. Likewise, the NorCal branch, I have a different list of cities for NorCal. It'll go down that branch. And if it isn't any of these cities, so in the case where it may be a city in California that we don't cover, or one that we've forgotten, it'll go down the default outcome, and of course right back into working with the VP of sales. So you can see the different branches right here. If it's not in California, it assigns it to the VP of sales. In this particular assignment, I get I look up the sales rep's info so that I can finish. In the case of SoCal, it assigns it to the sales manager for SoCal, likewise NorCal. And of course, we do the lookup to get the sales rep's information here. We assign the lead to them, and of course, do the update, send the task, and send the email. So a couple other things I want to mention as we go along here. One thing you want to do when you're working with flows is as you build these out, you want to save. You are connected to the cloud, and if you lose your connection and you haven't saved, you're going to lose your information. So save often and frequently, just a good use case. So let's go ahead and run this thing and kind of see what it looks like. So I'm going to grab a lead right here, and I'm going to go ahead and grab the lead ID. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to go ahead and click Run. So as an admin, you can run these without having to have them active. And it's going to launch a screen. I can put the lead ID info, or lead ID here. It did look it up. It is Mike. He is in Maryland, so we know he's not in California. So I've gone ahead and branched to other states in California. Good, I'm going down the right branch. The sales manager is Raul Mujica, and I've actually set the email address to a personal Gmail account with some plus addressing on it so that I can filter if I need to. And the next thing I should get is a processing screen. It says I can go ahead and close it. Now let's go back to Mike and make sure everything worked. So yep, the leads owner has been changed from myself as the admin to Raul, the VP of Sales, and I do have a task, and that task due date is set to 1 day from now. It's set to tomorrow. The other thing to check to see if we've gotten an email yet, and sure, here's a new email. Oops. There's the new email. And I've got some lead data here, but it's not really great. So a couple of things that we could do to make it better is that we could go to the fast lookup here. One thing that would probably help is email. So I'm going to go ahead and add email here. And I'm also going to grab a phone number. And I'm going to go ahead and OK. And I'm going to go ahead and save. And what this is saying is that I've got all of these screens in here. They won't cause any issues, but if I want to use them at runtime in what we call a trigger-ready flow, a flow that you can sort of launch automatically, you can't have any screens. So that's basically what it's telling me here. Now the other thing I want to do is I want to add the elements that I've just looked up. I want to add them to the email. So I'm going to look up. So here's the SBAR lead info. I just added email. So I'm going to scroll down until I see email here. I'm going to select that. I'm going to actually put that on a new line. And then the other thing I want to do is add the phone as well. Now the other thing you can do if you get comfortable is you can just manually edit these. And I'm just going to save that. I'm going to save my flow. I'm going to get that warning again. The other thing you want to do on the text template body that I haven't done yet is, as you notice, there are no labels. So I could easily add labels here. I'll just do one quickly in the interest of time. Just to give you an idea. Okay. Go ahead and save. All right, so let's test this again, but let's use a lead in California to see if we're really effective. So here's one from California. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to highlight that lead ID. I'm going to go back to the flow, close that screen. I'm going to run it. Actually, before I do that, let's take one step back. That lead is in a city that we don't have in our decision criteria. So let's update that as well. So it's a Northern California city. So to add that Northern California city, I'm going to add an OR condition. I'm just going to copy this from here. And I'm going to say Sebastopol. I need to delete that. I'm going to save this. I'm going to save. Go back. We're getting an error here. It's incorrect. Let's save correctly. Have to make sure we're using city. Want to make sure it equals Sebastopol. I typed that wrong. And I'm going to save it. And I'm going to save the flow. I'm still not liking what I'm doing. So I've actually entered it in the SoCal, but you get the gist. Let's make sure we've got our NoCal piece right as well. There we go. Typo there. Okay, we're getting no warnings. All right, let's go ahead and run it. Make sure I've got the right lead ID. And I put this in the SoCal, even though it's a NorCal city. I've branched to California. I've branched to SoCal. Elliot is the rep. I've got it set to the correct email address. And let's go take a look to make sure that it worked. So Elliot's now the owner of the lead. There's a task, and we should have another email. And you can see that I've now got the labels and the cities there. No information for phone, but I do have an email address. All right, so let's talk a little bit about deploying these flows and how you might deploy them. So one thing that you can do with flow is you can connect it to a button. And I have an example here where I've created a button. So I've gone to Customize, I've gone to Leads, and I've clicked Buttons and Links. And I'm going to go ahead and edit this so you can take a look at what it looks like and how it works. So in this case right here, I've given it a name, the button label, Process Lead, Detail Page button, and then I've grabbed the flow URL. I'll show you where that's located. So if you close this and you go back to your flow page, there's a URL right here. That's the flow URL. So that's where that information is coming from. And then I'm saying that the variable lead ID, that var lead ID, I've set a variable called var lead ID, equals the lead ID of the lead that I've clicked the button on. So that's how you sort of pass information into a flow. You can go ahead and save that. Now the other thing you have to do once you create a button is you have to put it on a page layout. And that's pretty simple as well. Since you've already created the button, just click the button list right here. You can see that I have the Process Lead button right here. I'm going to drag it to Custom Buttons. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then let's go back to our leads. Let's click another lead. Oh, I've already processed that one. Let's click this one right here. And you can see that Process Lead button is on here. I'm going to go ahead and process the lead. And it says that I'm completed. And if I refresh the screen, you can see that the owner's changed. We've got a task, and we should have yet another new email, and we do. So let me show you what's happening here. So what's actually happening is it's running this particular version of the flow. It'll run the most recent in debug mode. As you noticed, when I clicked that lead button, it didn't show any screens. So what I've done here is I've taken all the screens out, And the only thing that's in this is sort of the lead lookup, the decision logic, the assignment, and the task creation. Now, we have a pilot going on right now that we call the Trigger Ready Flow Pilot or Headless Flow Pilot. And what that pilot allows you to do is to create a workflow rule and launch a flow based on the criteria in that workflow rule. I'm actually not going to go into that today. It's a little bit more of advanced functionality. But in this use case, what you could do is anytime a lead came in, is you could automatically fire the flow to do the lead assignment. If you're interested in the pilot, please contact your Salesforce representative. If you have visual work, the main requirement is you have worked with Flow before. There's a workbook out there that you can get some experience if you don't have it. But if you do have experience and you want to experiment with the pilot, please feel free. It adds a lot of utility and functionality to the flow. All right. So that's sort of the how portion of it all. So best practices, just to recap: design before you build. Make sure you think through your flow. It's always a good idea to just build it out in the tool of your choice. You can use a Flow Designer or Visio or Lucidchart, whatever you like. Yeah, think through the variables you need, the elements you want to use really before you start. Use IDs to bring data and work with the data in the flow. It's an easy way to kind of make sure that things are on track. And then use screens for debug in screen flows. But if you have a trigger-ready flow or a flow that doesn't have screens, you can always use that email action to send yourself data. I'll come back to this, but we do have a survey. Your feedback's really important to us so we can improve. It's bit.ly/flow to go is the link here. A couple other things we want to cover. We have a Summer of Hacks event occurring. There's one this weekend, starts tomorrow in New York. Unfortunately, the one in Bangalore sold out. There's also one in LA on the 18th of July, 18th through the 20th, and then the weekend of the 25th in London. Dreamforce. Dreamforce is getting closer this year. I'm fairly new to Salesforce. I started in February. However, I've been to the last Dreamforce conferences. Have to say they're an awesome conference to go to. You get a lot of value, and if you're a Salesforce admin or user, very valuable for you to come to that conference. There's a developer discount code available, so you can register for $8.99. You can see the developer code there. So if you have any inclination of coming, make sure you register now and save yourself some cash. And then the last thing we'll do is actually start to take some questions. A couple of questions to answer. So someone asked what the book that I mentioned about business process. It's Michael Hammer's Re-Engineering the Corporation, a seminal book for anybody who's going to do process work. There's a lot of great early examples in that book of companies that made decisions to be very process-centric. What editions are Flow available? So it's available in the developer edition, obviously, but also the Enterprise and Unlimited. And it's free for the developer edition. So if you have professional edition and you want to go out and check Flow out, you can go get yourself a developer edition account and experiment with visual workflow. Robert asked, do I understand correctly that by using flows I can create records in Salesforce, which formerly required an Apex trigger? You sure can, and we have a couple of different ways to do that. So you can use a record create, or you can use the fast creates to do that. Why would I use Dave asked, why would you use a fast lookup versus a record lookup? Well, the simple answer to that is that with the fast elements, we really make more efficient use of how we communicate with the platform. So in the case where you have an S-object collection of 50 records and you need to update them, if you use the fast update to update those records, you consume sort of one DML limit versus the record create where you consume 50. So that's one simple answer. The other answer could be it's just that you just have one single thing you need to update, a single field or something. Just want to use it in terms of just that single update. That's what the record create and updates are. Big B asks, will you be going over troubleshooting flows and deciphering debug messages? In this amount of time, no. It is something that we are or will be addressing in subsequent versions or subsequent releases. We will be looking at our error messaging and debugging. In Summer 14, we actually have extended the information that we put into the debug logs. So it gives you sort of a, and while it's still, you know, sort of an Apex debug log, it gives you element by element execution information on what's happening. Another thing that we should talk about is the pilot. There are a number of features available in the pilot. So if you're if you don't have Summer 14 yet, you can turn on the pilot and you'll get all of the fast update elements, the loop, as well as the capability to do S-objects. And more importantly, you'll be able to launch a flow with an Apex start method or trigger it from a workflow rule. Now when Summer 14 hits, when we release that, you'll get all of that except for triggering a flow from a workflow rule. That will remain in pilot, and the reason is that we're actually making some significant improvements in how you build workflow rules and triggers that's coming. However, feel free to get into the pilot to experiment. Governor limits that I should be mindful of. Yes, Flow has its own limits. It also respects the limits of the platform. So there's a lot of nuance here in consumption of limits. You can certainly find yourself in the case where you've already started to consume limits. So maybe you've used some Apex and then you trigger a flow. That Apex has consumed some platform limits, and then the flow actually starts to consume limits. So it does require a little bit of, I will say, experimentation, really testing to kind of figure out where you might hit those limits. It's something that we're thinking through best how to address from a release standpoint, but be aware that that Flow has its limits as well as the platform. Now we will post a list of resources at the end of the webinar that you can look at. Sorry, you're looking at my lovely Google search screen. We will post resources at those on the webinar link itself. There's also there at the Success Community. You can also search for them, but they have more in-depth on exactly what all the limits are. So can you use an existing email template in Flow? So if you have an email alert template built, we do have an action for that in Summer 14. So the answer to that is yes. Will the Q&A be posted somewhere as well? Yes, we plan to post these at the links that you see there. Can flows be cloned? You can package up flows, and you can sort of, we do have the functionality where you can build a flow in your sandbox, test it out, make sure it works, package it, and then deploy it to your production organization. You can do that with our packaging method, various packaging method. The ant tool. If you have an IDE, you can also just use the sort of standard packaging that's available. So yes, the short answer is you can clone a flow. So the debug logs are actually, if you go into setup, you actually have to turn them on. But if you go into setup and go down to the bottom of setup, there's an option to see logs. If you click to request the logs, they'll actually be populated there, and you can kind of work through any debug issues. I found it very useful for myself personally, using the screens, and in the case where I don't have screens, sending myself email. Granted, I know you have to have Summer 14 on to sort of do that, but it's been the most efficient way that I've found to use debug information. Can flows fire automatically, or do we need a button? So that's what the trigger ready / headless flow. A lot of people know it as headless flow in the community pilot. Yes, a good example is this lead flow that we just saw, where I could create a workflow rule that says every time there's a new lead created, fire that particular lead processing flow. You could also Another area where we see flow used a lot is within cases. So if you have a web to case form out there, you could build a flow that is triggered and does case routing based on whatever your case routing logic is. Very powerful. The short answer is no, you don't need to just do it with a button. Use cases for a loop. So a good example of that I think of as being able to use a loop is if you need to do sort of a mass reassignment. So let's say you have a sales rep. That sales rep leaves the company and they have like 300 leads. You could build one S-object variable and bring that data in that one S-object collection variable. Bring that data into the flow, and then whatever criteria you use to assign your reps, you can loop through every one of those assigned accounts, contacts, or leads, whatever you're doing, and sort of reassign them within the loop to the appropriate rep, and then write it all back with one fast update to the appropriate object. So fairly powerful way to use a loop. You can think of a loop just like any type of if-then, or not if-then, but any type of looping operator that you might do in a programming language. Very powerful. So someone asked, can a flow compile all the information inputted by the user to create a new record? Certainly can. You can create a screen, have the user input all of the information in the screen, and then use that all of the data that the user's input to create a record. Another use case, sort of variation of that can be very interesting is if you could build a flow. Let's say you want to lock down the account or the contact information and only have it updated by a number of people. You could literally create a flow that allows your users to fill in a form to update or correct the information, route that form using an email to an admin who can update it. You could even create a custom object where it's actually put right into the custom object. So somebody could go back, an admin could go back, and you could even automate that process where, so I've got a flow, I've got my account data locked down, my users can update that data in a screen, it puts it in an object, and then on that object, each record that's created in the object, I could have a flow that can sort of enable the person who has the power to update the account data the ability to do that right from the flow. Yes, this webinar is recorded and it will be posted. Glad to hear it's information you need. Yes, we will. If you have any additional questions, so that's really, I didn't really say this on that slide, but if you leave the webinar and have questions, you can post it to our success community. That's the first link there, or you could post it on our developer forum. And you can always send me a question or post on my Twitter link. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. If I don't get back to you right away, it doesn't mean I didn't see your email or I'm not responsive or not responding. It's just probably because I'm engaged. But please send your questions. We have time for one more question. I didn't answer the question, why use visual workflow versus workflow? This is a good question. So workflow rules are really designed for a basic trigger criteria and a couple of actions or steps. If you have something that requires decision logic, the ability to loop through different records, ability to collect data, it really comes down to the complexity of the operations that you're trying to do. Another reason that you might want to use or implement visual workflow versus workflow is that if you have a number of workflow rules that could be combined into one flow, you could use visual workflow to sort of help you conserve those workflow rules. So that the net is that visual workflow can make the workflow rules you have more efficient. So I'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up. So is visual workflow the only way to make it pretty? So right now that's pretty much true. One of the things that we're going to be working on in a subsequent release in the near term, it's definitely on our roadmap, is to address Flow's runtime styling capabilities. We do know that people want to have more control over that. It's something that we will look at. You can deploy a visual workflow into Salesforce 1 today. However, the styling is even more limited there. So again, you have to put on a Visualforce page, and then you can deploy it. The community's done a good job of setting some examples there, but that's all. We want to address all of that in a subsequent release. So I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. Please feel free to send me questions, post questions to the community. I want to thank and give some gratitude to Shelly Ursig and Chris Duarte, who helped answer questions today. Also been very helpful to me learning not only Salesforce, but also my product that I'm looking after. I also want to thank the community and give gratitude to the community for all of the information that they put out and all of the help they provide each other. It's a really, really strong community, and it certainly has helped make the product even more useful. Thank you.